Now to welcome Montana Poet Laureate Chris Latreille to the Montana History Conference. Chris is a Métis storyteller, a descendant of the Pembina Band of the mighty Red River of the North, and an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians, who are headquartered right here in Great Falls. He's the author of One Sentence Journal, short poems and essays from the world at large, published by Riverfeet Press in 2018, and his brand new book, Becoming Little Shell, which was just released last month. Please welcome Chris Latreille.
Bonjour. Bonjour in Dinaway Maganadug. Chris Kosh and Nikashin. That is, hello, all of my relatives in Anishinaabe-moan, or Ojibwe-moan, or Chippewa. All different words for the same thing, which is the language of my people, of the Little Shell people. And it also is, you can call me Chris, in Michif, which is the other language of my Little Shell people. It's the language of the Michif people, the Métis people. So we are a mix of all of these things in, I believe, the most beautiful way possible within the body of a human person. And nobody even laughed. So it must be true. I like to begin with that summoning of the idea that we're all relatives, because we certainly are. As human animals, in relationship to each other, in relationship to the world around us, in relationship to our non-human relatives, in relationship to the fact that we're all a bunch of history nerds, which is a rare opportunity for me, because there's some things I'm going to talk about that nobody but people in this room will really understand. I'm here mostly, I guess, to talk about my new book, and I'm going to start with reading kind of a condensed excerpt of the introduction. But I feel a little ashamed, because even though the book went through pretty vigorous fact-checking, there's one fact that was missed that I didn't even realize was false. And I have to bring it up now because of John's wonderful memory of his friend, and it's related to the beautiful historical roadside markers we have in Montana that John has been such a huge part of providing us. There's a friend of mine who calls them brown boards, and I thought that was the official word for them. And I make that case quite vehemently in the book as brown boards. So number one, if that's not a fact, I'm sorry. Number two, if that takes root, I intend to take full credit for it. I mean, they're brown, right? And they're boards. It makes sense. How was I supposed to know? It's a midsummer morning in 2022 in western Montana, and dark clouds boil and roil and threaten thunderstorms. After days of swelter, the precipitation is welcome, but the threat of wildfire by lightning is real. I'm driving my gray 1999 Nissan Frontier pickup. I merge onto Interstate 90 westbound, where it intersects with Montana Highway 93 at the western edge of Missoula. These two routes, I-90 east-west, 93 north-south, are swarmed with tourist traffic every summer. These yearly visitors are here because this place is beautiful. The valley, formed by the confluence of the Blackfoot, Bitterroot, and Clark Fork rivers, is bordered by rolling mountains. Below the conifer-covered tree line, despite summer settling in with a vengeance, their slopes still show a hint of spring's green where they aren't patched in yellow arrowleaf balsam root. Indigenous words are on my mind today. There are countless shiny cars, hulking SUVs, and gigantic pickups pulling trailers loaded with canoes and kayaks and bicycles. I note names like Tacoma and Denali on their bumpers. Same with RVs called Yukon and Winnebago. There are others too, Indian names all, in a place not that many Indians remain. I've thought about Indians my entire life. I grew up with the vague knowledge my father's side of the family was Indian, Chippewa specifically, as my grandmother would speak of it at times. I have a dim memory of being 4 years old and sitting on the faded linoleum kitchen floor of our little farmhouse in Huson, assaulting a coloring book with crayons. When asked why I depict a pair of children with red skin, I say it's because they're Indians. My visiting grandmother, Ruby Catherine Doney Latreille, sitting at the table asks, "Is my skin red?" "No, but I'm an Indian, and so are you." I was very young, and now I'm not, but the memory has stuck with me. It wasn't until my grandfather died just shy of 83 years of age in late September 1996 that pieces started falling into place. I was 29 years old. A decade earlier, fresh out of high school, two friends and I headed west on the same Interstate 90 I'm traversing today on our way to Seattle to become rock stars. I hadn't seen my grandparents since making the move. By 1996, I was married with a 3-year-old son who would never meet his great-grandfather, living closer to Tacoma than Seattle, and working a job that required a long, traffic-infested commute that was slowly killing my will to live. The dreams of rock and roll glory were over. I like to tell people my bandmates and I arrived in Seattle with bags full of spandex and leather when the city was on the cusp of dressing all their musical heroes in flannel and ripped jeans. In 1996, I made the drive to Plains, Montana for the funeral. Though I barely knew my grandfather, I was one of the pallbearers. It was a beautiful fall day in early October. I left my Washington home in the wee hours of morning, crossed Snoqualmie Pass eastbound through the jagged and magnificent Cascade Mountains at sunrise, then blew through the croplands of eastern Washington as the day expanded in my windshield. The sun was bright, the foliage was changing to vivid reds and yellows, and the air was crisp and clean the entire way. Arriving at the small Catholic church in Plains, I was amazed to find the nave crowded with Indians. I took my seat in the front row beside my dad and stared around in a state of puzzled awe. During the service, which I barely remember, it seemed to be more about Jesus than my grandfather, Dad kept poking me in the ribs and trying to make me laugh. When we exited the church and prepared to join the procession to the cemetery, Dad leaned in and asked, "So, what did you think about all of those Indians?" "There were a lot of them," I said, for lack of a better answer. What I didn't say was how astounded I was. Something my dad and his father had in common was the denial of any indigenous heritage. Suggesting my dad was native made him angry. I could never understand why. I was the opposite. I wanted to be Indian. I wanted that identity, and I took it for myself, even if it had to be largely locked up. To me, it was cool. Who wouldn't want to be Indian? Who wouldn't want to be Chippewa? My grandfather's funeral was a turning point in my curiosity about my family history. Here was a collection of people I'd never known but was clearly connected to. Who were they? Why didn't I know them? Why was I never allowed to know them? What was our family story? I went home with more questions, only now I could see much more clearly where I came from, even if nobody in my family talked about it. Whenever anyone asked my dad about other Latreilles in Montana, and there are many of us, he would deny any relation. I never heard him utter the words Little Shell, Rocky Boy, Turtle Mountain, or even Chippewa that I can recall, nor Métis, all words for people and places critical to my life now. My dad spent his life denying his indigenous heritage, and through his choice, mine as well, sometimes vehemently. Referring to my dad as Indian in any way in most contexts bordered on fighting words. If pressed, his calmest response was to refer to the entire idea of Indianness as complete bullshit. When he passed away in 2014, Dad left me with a lifetime of questions about who he was and where he came from. No, who we are, where we come from. I'm certain that he had the answers to many of these questions, but he chose to take them with him to his grave. I decided I would do what I could to find them on my own, if not from him, then through people who lived a similar experience, through the story of our people. This book, Becoming Little Shell, is an attempt to answer some of those questions, to tell the story of my own family heritage, certainly, and why my dad felt the way he did about his heritage. If I've learned anything at all, it's that I'm not the only one to grow up in these kinds of circumstances. I'm also not alone in trying to find my way back to who I was all along. A proud Indian. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a historian. I don't have an academic bone in my body. I'm a storyteller, and this is a story that needs telling. I feel compelled to share the story of the Métis people of Montana with the world, to tell the story of the Little Shell tribe, the longtime landless Indians of Montana. Because it's clear we're largely unknown, not just to the wider world, but even in Montana, the first state to recognize us as a legitimate tribe, despite our centuries-old association with a larger Indigenous family. Like the stories of all Indigenous tribes of the Americas, it's a sad story. It's also a triumphant story of the baddest buffalo people the world has ever seen. It's a story still unfolding. So that's my condensed introduction. And thank you. I have no idea how much time I have, so I'm just going to start talking, and if you need to run me out, run me out. I'm going to assume that most of the people here know who the Little Shell are, but I'm going to give a brief introduction anyway. So we are the most recently federally restored tribe in the United States. We received that restoration in December of 2019. Yes. Do we have, and I know we do, any Little Shell people in the room today? A couple of you, a few of you. Every word of this book that I've written is for you. We received our federal restoration in 2019, like on a Thursday, and like the following Monday, I had the numbers 574 tattooed on my knuckles, because that is what we are. We're the 574th federally restored tribe. And people ask me, you know, why did you need federal recognition? Well, most tribes in the United States received their federal recognition, their relationship with the federal government as sovereign nations through treaties. And it was in 1871 that the United States decided they were no longer going to make treaties with indigenous tribes and stop treating them as sovereign nations. And our interactions with the feds kind of started past 1871. And like many other tribes, we kind of got left out of that relationship. And it wasn't until 1978 that the United States decided that we need to figure out a way to work with these tribes who never got federal recognition so that they can have the same opportunities that all of the other indigenous tribes have. As an aside, I can play fast and loose with some of these dates sometimes in other audiences, and I'm really nervous about getting something wrong. So bear with me and trust that I often forget stuff and it gets wrong by the time it leaves my mouth, which is why I carry some tattoos, because this is all the shit I don't want to forget. It's like the original Palm Pilot. So that's who we are as Little Shell. We are so closely related to the Turtle Mountain Chippewa in North Dakota that we are essentially the same people. I like to say I could disenroll as Little Shell today and enroll Turtle Mountain tomorrow. In fact, the man we are named after, Little Shell, was Little Shell as a title. It wasn't his actual name. It was a title given to hereditary chiefs of the Pembina Band of Chippewa. Our Little Shell, whom we are named for, was the third such Little Shell. He was the one who did negotiate the creation of the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota in 1883, 1882. And before then, we were known as the Pembina Band. And we were this mixed community of Chippewa, probably some Nakota or Assiniboine, as well as Métis people who lived on both sides of the medicine line, the border with Canada. We didn't cross the border crossed us. So when the reservation was created, the Pembina Chippewa became the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And as things unfolded, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, ultimately, through various shenanigans and chicanery, Little Shell and anybody who followed him were disenrolled from the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, and that's how we became the landless Indians of Montana. And I always like to kind of pause for a moment and ask people to consider that briefly. The idea that any indigenous people on any continent, let alone ours, could ever be considered landless in the first place. What kind of society are we talking about that allows that to happen? Who actually actively makes it happen? And we were that for more than 100 years, depending on the date that you set. I began ours as early as the 1850s and certainly in the 1860s, because that's when the die was really cast that ultimately left us landless and living on the fringes of communities like this one in Great Falls, existing on Hill 57, which to many people is just a place for poor Indians, but for us is a holy place. Just like the Turtle Mountains of North Dakota are a holy place. And there's reasons for that. And I talk about it in the book. Well, who are the Métis? The Métis people are recognized, unique indigenous cultural group, recognized as Canada's 3, but not recognized in the United States at all. We're the same people. And Canada recognizes the First Nations, the Inuit people to the north, and the Métis as their 3 indigenous peoples, predating the creation of their country. The Métis flag flew before the Canadian flag did. So we have a long, long history, even though our culture rises from the first interactions between Europeans and indigenous people, beginning in the late 1600s in the Red River Valley at the Red River Settlement, which is today is Winnipeg, Manitoba. That's where we rise from. And if all of those shenanigans and chicanery had not happened, odds are I wouldn't be here, because my family place would be to the east of us. Yet here we are. So there's all kinds of challenges when it comes to writing history. For me, this book is as much memoir as it is a book of history. And I'm sure you can understand how difficult it was for me to leave a bunch of history on the cutting room floor, because I wanted to write one of those sweeping things of dates and names and stuff like that. And my editor, when I turned in the first draft, was like, yeah, this is great, but we need more of you in it. I was like, oh God, now it's got to be one of those books. So I did my best to try and mix what was the most important elements of our history with the story of someone like me. And there are many of us who are trying to reconnect with that, despite generations of erasure about who we are, where we came from, and what we have contributed to everything that has happened in our part of the world. My mentor, who I'm sure many of you knew, Nicholas Vrooman, who sadly passed away 6 months before we achieved our federal restoration, once told me that there's enough undiscovered history on the Northern Plains, particularly as it relates to indigenous people, that a dozen historians could devote their careers to it and they would never overlap. Now, Nicholas was prone to even as much hyperbole as I often am, but the more I learn, the more I realize how right he was. That erasure is part of the complications of history. Since my book came out, I've gone and spoken in small groups, large groups in 9 states and counting. And I just last week was out on the East Coast. And what's curious about the East Coast, the biggest difference for me is that out here, there are parts that don't look so different from what they looked like a couple hundred years ago. From back when we were rolling out onto the plains with a train of 50 or 100 or 700 Red River carts to hunt buffalo. It's not that different. You can squint and imagine what it was like. Out there, you can't squint at anything. Because if you squint, you're probably going to get run over by any number of vehicles or bicycles or skateboards or those things people ride now that are like a skateboard with a handle on it. It's totally different out there. And then there's the monuments. I was in Richmond, Virginia, and did an event at Shelf Life Books in Richmond. And I visited the Hollywood Cemetery, which there's a big section of Confederate soldier graves, which, regardless of the side of the fight, it's tragic. The number of people who die for these disagreements, despite all of us having so much more in common than we have in difference. And there's also like this big monument to, well, that one's gone, Robert E. Lee. So in Richmond, they have this boulevard of Monument Boulevard or something. They took all those down. But Jefferson Davis is the one I'm talking about, the president of the Confederacy. Then I found myself a few days later in Gettysburg, which is the 180 degrees away from the celebration of the southern side of that conflict. And all of the, markers as to where this battery was and where these troops of infantry were. And there's these, I swear to God, all of those Civil War generals must have worked out because they're all like really buff in their statues. It's like they were watching their eating, what they ate, counting their calories, the whole thing, because they don't look like anybody I see anymore. So I see these guys, Sherman, Gibbon, all of these guys that as soon as the war was over, they came west and started killing my people. And that is hard to swallow as an Indigenous person in the United States. Because everything that is built, everything that we celebrate, even at conferences like this, are on the soil of land that we used to live and thrive on, that we were removed from. And that is the challenge, I think, that we face. Because most of us now recognize that. We're having a conversation about the 250-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution, or whatever it is. See, that's how much I care about United States documentation. Though we were having a conversation last night over dinner about how the joke being that only Indians, dogs, and horses need papers. Like I have my tribal ID, it's my papers that proves I'm able to be Indian. And that I like to tease my dogs when they get a little uppity and remind them that in our household, I'm the only one who actually has papers. So, what I want to talk about next, and this is going to be difficult, because I'm a crier anyway. I'm crying that some of you are eating and I'm not. Part of that drive from Virginia through the Shenandoah National Park, one thing I didn't know is that park was created because the national parks out west were so successful. They wanted something in the East Coast that could generate that kind of economic largesse on the East Coast. And the last thing they did before creating is there were a bunch of settlers living there, white settlers, but they were all removed just like we were, just like the folks living in Yellowstone National Park were removed in order to create the park. And I never knew that. And surprisingly, I felt a lot of solidarity with those folks who were just trying to live their lives and they were doing the best they could. And because some big important people wanted where they lived, they had to go without any thought about where they were going to go. And that bummed me out. So then I drive down and I'm on my way to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I drive right by Carlisle. Carlisle, as we know, is the site of the Indian Industrial School, ground zero for the boarding school era of United States history, which only in the last couple of years has there really been a lot of discussion about. And there wasn't any discussion about it until they started finding unmarked graves of children in Canada. And then they started digging around a little bit on this side of the medicine line. We're finding it in the United States as well. So the Carlisle School was started by Richard Henry Pratt in 1879. And over the couple decades that it was in operation, there were over 10,000 children who went through that school. And they have 140 tribes represented there, and they figure there were 186 children who died. I guarantee it was far more than 186. That's the 186 that they dug them up. And if you go to Carlisle, if you want to see the cemetery, you have to have clearance. You have to have a background check before you can even get through the gate, because now it's an army base. So I had to give them my ID, and I had to wait and see if it was okay for me to go and visit the resting place of perhaps not my direct relatives, but certainly people related, because we are all related in one way. There's not one Indigenous person in the United States whose family was not touched by boarding schools. And I'm often asked when I do my presentations if my family had anybody who had to go to boarding school. And I've always said no. Because to my knowledge, nobody had. Right now at Carlisle, you can't even see the cemetery where those graves are because there's a chain link fence around it. And the fence is covered with really thick black, like, you know how we have blue tarps out here? They have black ones there. And you can't see through it. And it's there because they're in the act of tribes coming and bringing their children home. It's happened, it wasn't from Carlisle, I don't believe, but we had a little shell burial. Fort Belknap folks just recently brought some children home, and the Lakota people just recently brought some home. So they keep it covered so that nobody can see what's going on there. I think the way that Carlisle is being handled right now is a travesty, especially when I measure it against how we celebrate the history of the South in Richmond, how we celebrate the history of these northern military people. And yet, yes, the Civil War is critical. Yes, World War II needs to be memorialized. Yes, the Vietnam War needs to be memorialized. But what about the place that is ground zero for what was the massive pulverizing machine, or something like as Teddy Roosevelt called it, to eliminate Indigenous people? I would like to see Carlisle turned into some form of a memorial to respect the people who died there, the children who died there, what that did to generations of families, and the United States taking some ownership as being critical in that happenstance. Thank you. So I came home, and a couple of weeks ago I was out on the West Coast doing events. And in Olympia, my cousin, who I've only seen a couple times in my life, came out to watch. Her father was my dad's brother. My dad had a brother and a sister. And I mentioned my uncle in Becoming Little Shell because the day my father died, the morning my father died, my uncle called the house as we're sitting there waiting for the funeral home to come and take my father's body away. My uncle calls to tell my dad that he just learned their sister had died. So in the same day, my uncle finds out he's the only one left. And I've never known him. And in the book, I talk about that I don't know that I would recognize him if he walked through the door now, or if he would recognize me if he walked through the door now. And my cousin, she's just a couple years younger than me. Her name is Paige. She came out to my event and she quoted that. And she said, "You're wrong. He reads your newsletter. He follows your career, all of these things. He's the one who told me you were going to be here." And I was deeply moved by that. And for Paige, hearing my book event and the history of our people and all those things that she didn't know, was very emotional for her. So just 2 days ago, I get a text from her saying she was talking to her father that morning, and he told her that our grandfather went to the boarding school in St. Ignatius, Montana. That was a revelation that our family has not been aware of from the entirety of my life. I thought I was going to hyperventilate. I was just, because it answers so many of those questions that I raise in my condensed introduction. Why did my grandfather feel that way? Why did they not want to be connected to the rest of the family? It is by the point by point by point example of what boarding schools did to Indigenous people. Taught him to be ashamed of who he was. Taught him to not speak the language that his mother spoke, that I know she spoke because my mom heard her speak it. So just 2 generations removed, we have lost that language in my family. Not just in my family, because the last first language speaking Ojibwe speaker in Montana died of COVID, or died during COVID. So we don't have anybody left. Not in Montana anyway. So that experience at that boarding school puts me in a position where I could devote the rest of my life to learning that language, which is probably the most important thing we could do as Indigenous people, is revive our languages. I could devote the rest of my life to it, and I will never be fluent. And odds are, even if we can devote all of our resources that we have to create revitalization language programs, we probably won't have another first language speaking. What that means is being born into a household where that language is the language spoken. And then English becomes the second language. So despite whatever effort we make, I will never know of a first language speaking Ojibwe speaker in Montana probably in my lifetime, unless somebody comes from somewhere else and moves here. So these are critical. And that revelation about my grandfather totally changed my view of him, because he was a hard ass and he was abusive to my father, and I have had a resentment towards him for my entire life. But knowing that he experienced this horrible interaction that they never chose totally changes my relationship to his memory and answers these questions that I thought I would never know, that I could guess because of the experiences of other people, but now I know. And how is that going to impact the rest of my life? Which is a long way to just draw attention to what everybody in this room already knows, is the importance of these little details and the personal stories of the families who live here. It's not about these buff dudes who go to the gym and then show up to get on their horse and be carved into granite. They have roles to play, but it's the everyday lives of people and how they live and how the decisions made by those big shots affect the rest of us. History, we just focus too often on the big names, and we forget the people who suffer to make those people famous. The Little Shell story, it's easy to focus on the negative, the same way when people talk about Hill 57 being a place of illness and poor people and all that. But it's only that if that's what you're looking for. There's lots to celebrate about the role of Hill 57 right here in Great Falls. That's why our tribe is doing so much to acquire land around there, so that can become an important place for us to gather. Last summer, not just maybe 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, we had our first powwow on our own land and our own arbor up on Mount Royal right next to Hill 57 in the history of our people. And we will be gathering there every year now for as far into the distance as we can see. And that's important. And that's an example of a positive thing we're doing, how we held out. And I get asked these types of things. Well, what about this and what about that? The Little Shell people are living proof that the long game works. We in this culture tend to, if we have an idea on Thursday, if we can't pull it off by Sunday, we're like, screw it, that was a bad idea. We're not very good at the long game, but the long game works. Whatever change we want to see made, whatever preservation we want to see happen. And many of you have worked on projects like that. It's the long game of getting knocked down and getting back and trying and trying. People devoting their lives to it who know they will never survive to see the final result, but that's no reason not to do it. And because of generation upon generation upon generation of people who did not give up in their efforts to see us restored to who we have always known we were anyway, the result of that is this beautiful healthcare facility that we built in Great Falls, or that we restored. The powwow arbor, as I mentioned. Our efforts with a big warehouse to do food sovereignty, and we're going to do a tour tomorrow. You can just make a list of all of these positive things that we have done as Little Shell people for our own community and that we share with the community at large. And I think that's important to note also. Rather than focus on being landless and all of these things, that's in the past, and we are moving forward. And I'm proud of that. We have had to totally remake ourselves multiple times. And so many of these things, I know, you're not really, there's two things you shouldn't talk about and speak unfavorably of in Great Falls. One is Lewis and Clark. I'm not going to go there, trust me. The other one's Charlie Russell. And while I love Charlie Russell's work, I hold him personally responsible for making the entire world, because of the success of his work, he's made the entire world think that all Indians look like extras from Dances with Wolves. And we don't look like that. I want to end with the story of my great-great-grandparents. And I mentioned Charlie Russell and all of that as kind of a prelude to this discussion. Because when we think of people hunting, subsistence hunting buffalo on the open plains, those old paintings of Russell make it seem like it was so long ago. Indians on horseback with bows and arrows and things like that. And yes, that happened. But it was before Charlie ever arrived on the scene. So it wasn't that long ago. And the proof of that clear vision of when that was is 1879. 1879 is when the town of what would ultimately become Lewistown, when that settlement was established. And it was established by a group of 20 Métis families who had come down from the Red River Valley, been living on the Milk River for about a decade, and been burned out twice by the U.S. government. Nelson Miles, to be specific, which is why when I'm in Custer County and I go to Miles City, I'm a little nervous. Nelson Miles gave them, my way or the highway, and the highway's that way, and if you stick around, you're going to get burned out again. So we went down into the Judas Basin on Big Spring Creek and started this community that is now Lewistown. Well, why did we go there? That was one of the last places that you could still subsistence hunt wild buffalo on the plains. And there's this great story that I've read from 3 different perspectives about when they were on their way down there, and they came across some buffalo. So a bunch of the men rode out to run the buffalo, which is the word for hunting them. And how these buffalo got in among the carts, and a bunch of carts got tipped over, and there was mayhem and chaos. And I know it happened because I've read 3 different perspectives. But I bring that up because those are my great-great-grandparents who are visible to me on this horizon. Depending on the birth order, my great-great-grandfather Mose and great-great-grandmother Susie, good Catholic family. They had like 13 kids, however many grandkids, however many great-grandkids. Depending on when I was born, I could have known them. And they were buffalo hunters. And this was a community that was right on the edge of change. Not just for us, but for all the indigenous buffalo tribes that congregated in central Montana in the mid and late 1870s into the early 1880s when they were all gone. So we think about that, and that is not ancient history, and that just massive change that a whole culture, multiple cultures, had to adapt to. Proves to me again that as a community, like we are in this room and in the towns around us, we can adapt to these big changes that seem insurmountable. And indigenous people, Little Shell, Chauvin, Blackfeet, Crow, all of us, we are examples of surviving catastrophic changes, whether it's ice ages. When I speak the few words of Anishinaabe, and I know I'm speaking words that were spoken by people who used to live by throwing spears at mastodons. It's that old. So we've survived that. We've survived colonialism. We have survived taking the best shot that the most powerful nation in the world could deliver right on the chin. We rolled around on the ground a little bit, got up, dusted ourselves off, and said, we're still here. So I like to think of us and the story of the Little Shell people as just an example that we can overcome. We can come together. We can make good changes. We can figure out new ways to live well again. And that anybody who throws their hands up and says it's useless, needs to rethink their own privilege. Because if you're not willing to participate in the effort to restore and change and make better, that means you're too comfortable with the way things are. And there's no time for that. So with that, I have no idea where I'm supposed to go or when. I usually do Q&A, but we're not really set up for Q&A, unless people have questions. Anybody? Romiguech, Chimiguech, thank you very much for your attention and for your commitment to history.
Thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate those excellent and really thought-provoking comments. You can please join me in just one more round of applause for Chris. Time and complete that form and turn it in at the registration desk, or you can mail it in to us later. We do use those forms to inform our next conference. And finally, a reminder, don't forget to bid early and often at the MAM conference or the MAM silent auction, which will close after dinner this evening. Our afternoon sessions start at 2:15, and so with that, we hope you enjoy the rest of your lunch and your afternoon sessions. Thank you.